I'm delighted to introduce Professor Vaziri. She has published articles in Philosophy Today, Comparative, Rhizomes, Cultural Studies and Emerging Knowledge, and TDR, the Drama Review, among other journals. Her new book, Racial Blackness and Indian Ocean Slavery, reveals how Iranian cinema preserves the legacy of the vast and yet long overlooked history that has come to be known as Indian Ocean slavery. Professor Vaziri shows that Iranian film preserves the legacy of African slavery's longue durée in ways that resist its overpowering erasure in the popular and historical imagination. Of this work, poet, scholar, and as some of you know, recent visiting professor, Fred Moten, has written, Parisa Vaziri's care for Iranian cinema reveals a complex archive, a curriculum of vigor that exceeds local abstraction. Its new waves and new particularities are symptoms of the global. Her deep analytic concern with racial blackness disrupts the givenness of self and world. Rigorously, beautifully, Vaziri transforms the history of the Indian Ocean and the history of cinema. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Vaziri.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the coordinators of Chats in the Stacks for inviting me to participate in this program and helping me to facilitate all the logistics, especially Jenny and Adriana, who helped with making posters and sending out notifications. I didn't realize how daunting it would be to give a talk about this book. On the one hand, there's just so much to cover, and on the other hand, there's so many different ways to approach the material, different ways to talk about it. So I thought I'd begin with a kind of general overview and then move into discussing a few different examples that are really quite distinct. And this is just for people who are tuning in through Zoom. For those of you who are physically here, I have some flyers out on the table that my publisher very generously made, a promotional code that you can use to purchase a copy of the book off of their website. And so that's that code at the bottom of the right-hand side of the screen. So to kind of move into a very general overview of this book, I think it's helpful to look at the three major terms in the title: racial blackness, Indian Ocean slavery, Iran's cinematic archive, which I'll sometimes just call Iranian cinema. Each of these terms appears to have its own kind of self-evidence. And I think one of the unique things about this book is that these terms have never been brought together in this way. I'm just pointing that out because it shows something about my disciplinary background, where I'm coming from. I understand this book primarily to be a work of theory, and it's important for me to say that at the outset for two reasons. The first is that, regardless of whatever part of the Indian Ocean one might be talking about, whatever part of Southwest Asia, which is traditionally referred to as the Middle East, whatever kind of area one is talking about, one is usually talking about that under the rubric of area studies. And my book is really moving against that rubric to the extent that I find area studies to rely on a model of information extraction. So to write against information extraction, to write against information also complicates the act of giving this talk. Because a lot of what I have to say about Indian Ocean slavery has to do with its resistance to becoming information, its resistance to becoming fact. And that resistance is embodied in the form of the writing of the book. So I don't want to subordinate the enigmas of transmission to what we too readily want to grasp as the content. And that enigma is partially interpreted or expressed by the book's the designer of the book's cover, where the letters are so soft they almost blend into the background of the cover, and you can hardly read what it says. So although everything I have to say is related to the book, it's just one discourse layered on top of another. And although this is kind of so obvious to the point of being banal, I just want to point it out at the beginning, because this inevitable distortion or errancy that belongs to the process of transmission and repetition is one of the conceptual building blocks of the book's argument. And then the second way that I understand this primarily as a theoretical work is that it's speculative. It's unapologetic about being speculative and is intended primarily to generate thinking about the construction of facts rather than to simply yield or transmit facts that can or should be taken at face value. I do obviously frame the project with a level of concern for the empirical, but before moving into that world, I'd first just like to broaden the frame out a bit more to discuss what I think is one of the more conceptually extravagant dimensions of the book, which is, again, the way that I'm bringing these three terms together. And I do that essentially through a kind of long, drawn-out analogy between the technological apparatus of cinema, the theory of slavery as a kind of ontological disruption in time and space, and the concept of racial blackness as an ongoing disruption and recontextualization of its own meaning. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of the talk trying to break this formulation down to the extent that I can. So these first two terms, racial blackness and Indian Ocean slavery, we tend to know racial blackness in its relationship to a history of dispossession of enslaved Africans in the Americas and evolving theories of race that serve to justify it. Some of you might be familiar with this book, Lyndon Barrett's posthumously published Racial Blackness and the Discontinuity of Western Modernity, which I'm choosing somewhat arbitrarily here because there are so many good books that make a similar argument that transatlantic slavery ushers in a discontinuity in history, wherein the rise of modern subjectivity becomes tied to the dispossession of blackness. I'm choosing Barrett's book primarily because the title is just so illustrative and explicit about a point that has been made throughout the scholarship of Black studies. I'm also starting this way because this kind of necessity of beginning with transatlantic slavery, as I'm doing right now, is a common way of introducing Indian Ocean slavery, because they are two histories that are often thought about in oppositional terms. And when I was just starting to work on the dissertation version of this book, it was my own unfamiliarity with Indian Ocean slavery and my frustrations with the existing scholarship that in some ways motivated me to work on this project. So the Indian Ocean is a very vast space, and I have to take a moment to clarify what I am referring to when I invoke this term. And there are many different ways people talk about Indian Ocean slavery. Some people reference it to talk about the Dutch slave system, which drew captive labor primarily from the Indian subcontinent in the 17th century. Some use it to describe the 18th century French slave trade east of Madagascar. Some people use this term to refer to Omani plantation labor on the east coast of Africa. I guess I should be using my cursor to point all this out, but I'm having trouble finding there. There it is. But the connotation of Indian Ocean slavery that I'm primarily concerned with refers to the slave trades from East Africa to the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia, which existed in some anecdotal form since antiquity, but really becomes legible with the integration of the Persian Gulf into global markets in the 19th century. So Indian Ocean slavery is often introduced through distinctions from transatlantic slavery. And one way is to talk about that difference in terms of a difference between agricultural or chattel slavery and domestic slavery. To call slavery domestic and non-productive has historically been the equivalent of calling it irrelevant. The fact that Indian Ocean slavery is thought of as a domestic form of enslavement has led to a consensus about its generally benign or mild character, which is an idea that's so common it has a name. It's called the good treatment thesis. The second major distinction is the distinction between racial and non-racial slavery, which is pretty simple. First, the idea that no correlating concept of race commensurate with what we know in the West, commensurate with what we know was developed and mobilized in Europe and the Americas, existed in Indian Ocean societies prior to its colonial introduction. And then the idea that Indian Ocean slavery was transracial, meaning that it was not only or even primarily comprised of African captivity, but of diverse human populations, most famously the enslavement of Turks, peoples from the Caucasus, who were known largely as Mamluks. And then finally, the idea that Indian Ocean slavery has left no lasting legacy or imprint in collective consciousness. And I push this last point a little bit further to say that instead of a collective memory, there's a collective resistance to the memory of Indian Ocean slavery, or to shift that language slightly, that Indian Ocean slavery resists becoming history. What happens when, suspending our expectation for facts, we pay attention instead to the resistance to facts? So, as you might be able to sense by now, I have a healthy suspicion about the way that our facts have been constructed up until now. So it might seem strange to insist on this term racial blackness when race too is, after all, a form of an illicit form of factification, of reification. But my insistence on placing this term in the title, at the beginning of the title, is an acknowledgement of the politicized dimensions of telling this history in the present, an emphasis on history as an act rather than history as a static and disembodied thing. So the book is in conversation with activism of Black collectives in Southwest Asia and North Africa, who are demanding that we reckon with the racial legacies of Indian Ocean and trans-Saharan slavery. And these groups, although they have accumulated quite a bit of support, still are frequently ridiculed or silenced by way of the claim that Blackness does not exist, or that it is incoherent in these contexts. And rather than deny this incoherence or interpret incoherence as pathological, I choose to mobilize the alleged incoherence of racial Blackness in the Indian Ocean positively. And in the conclusion of the book, I engage a bit more with the work of one of these collectives, the Collective for Black Iranians. So, racial Blackness is incoherent, non-existent, out of context in the Indian Ocean. This is the allegation that I'm contending with, and it's through talking about film that I'm able to activate different potencies and contradictions of this concept, context, what it means to be out of context. I will try to explain this more thoroughly with examples. For now, here are just a few quotes that I hope will foreshadow some resonances throughout these materials. The making of films is in principle nothing but cutting and splicing, the chopping up of history before the lens. This is the media theorist Friedrich Kittler from Gramophone Film Typewriter. Scattered scenes glued together with the special tape of cinema. This is the Iranian film critic Amir Hushain Qavusi from a Persian film journal in the 1950s. The slave is violently uprooted from his milieu. Orlando Patterson, Slavery and Social Death. The revalorization of the sign of Blackness led to a psychic emancipatory explosion. Sylvia Wynter on how we mistook the map for the territory. So the cinema-specific argument that I make in the book is primarily an argument about the stylistic strategies of two major film movements in Iran. And before getting into a discussion of genre, it's useful to take a step back again to contemplate more generally what cinema bodes as a global medium, a global event, and how it has participated and reflected upon a certain fragmentation of the world, a radical decontextualization of time and space, what Kittler is calling the chopping up of history. So in the 20th century, cinema starts to deplete the physical intimacy of traditional forms of storytelling, like naqali or pardedari, that revolved around a master storyteller delivering stories of Persian epic to live audiences in intimate settings like coffee houses. And this is an image of a naqali performance, kind of ironically from a film. I say ironic because historically film kind of takes over and makes obsolete these more traditional forms of storytelling. Cinema radically decontextualizes. It literally replaced, or one could even say destroyed, more familiar forms of cultural transmission. At the same time, cinematic images also purport to be straightforward representations of reality. So cinema does not just cut, it splices, it dissociates and conjoins, but not always according to coherent logics. So I'd like to put emphasis on this tension or contradiction between the destruction of the integrity of time and space and this idea of cinema as the reproduction of naturalized perception. So I see this tension playing out in the strategies pitting cinematic movements against one another. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I want to mention that some of the images and the clips that I show might be uncomfortable to sit with. Two of the major filmmaking modes that I engage in the book are filmfārsi and alternative filmmaking, which is usually captured by the heading the Iranian New Wave. And to condense a lot of material into a more or less simple idea, I show that mid-century debates among Iranian film critics and filmmakers about the status of montage were not just aesthetic debates, that they were political debates, and that filmmakers developed a language, a cinematic language that drew upon Blackness for its articulation. And in the meantime, they created and preserved artifacts of Indian Ocean slavery that could be considered both historical traces and simultaneously repressions of history. So these are two different contradictions, fragmentation and conjunction, and repression and preservation. I'm following the interplay between these two contradictions. So this is the dominant mode of commercial filmmaking in Iran in the 20th century between the 1950s and 1970s. And these films were disparagingly known as filmfārsi. They were action-driven and characterized by very cliché plot themes that pitted tradition against modernity. They were usually comprised of escapist melodramas and romance narratives, violence, and as you can see, the hypersexualization of women. And these posters also give you a sense of the kind of aimless and chaotic cinematic strategies that comprised filmfārsi. I'll play a very brief clip of a somewhat arbitrarily chosen trailer, just because it's hard to find relatively good quality copies of these films. This is to give you a sense of the sort of chaotic montage practices. So one chapter of the book is primarily concerned with filmfārsi, and there are two major points that I draw out about it. There are kind of a set of traditional complaints one makes about this cinema, and it's usually connected to the way that it promoted values associated with American-style consumerism and the sexualization of women. I focus on something else. I focus on filmfārsi's adaptation of an indigenous form of improvisatory theater called siyah-bazi, or black play, that when it becomes translated to cinema becomes almost indistinguishable from racialized blackface minstrelsy. I am going to play a clip of one of these blackface scenes, but this is a caveat for anyone in the audience who might know something more than the traditional audience member about Iranian cinema. The clip that I'm going to show is from a film that some people might argue should not be considered filmfārsi, and I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A if that's something you want to get into. The granularity of film taxonomy is not my primary concern, and I do treat filmfārsi more as an idea rather than a strictly bounded category. Okay. So I think I didn't play the dialogue before the scene that you watched, but if we had watched it and if you had some familiarity with Persian, you would be able to tell that grammatically and tonally the speech of the blackface character is distorted. And this distortion is typical of the blackface character and siyah-bazi, and seems to produce a kind of fantasy about blackened speech that's also connected to a degendering of the figure. So in that dialogue, the character professes to having a female name, Layla, which is part of what makes the audience laugh. So in this scene and in siyah-bazi practices more generally, the blackface figure, the siyah, assumes the rhetorical posture of a slave who responds to a master figure. There is a lot one could say about this particular scene, about siyah-bazi more generally. Here I'll just focus on the fact that I was interested in the fact that these are scenes, that they belong to a long tradition of itinerant improvisatory theater, where musical troupes would travel from home to home as well as gather in public places to perform. So, for example, this scene takes place on a cafe stage, presumably in the city. So there's a kind of resonance between the original itinerancy of siyahbazi, black play, a material context instability in the medium of film, and in particular in the stylistic mode of filmfārsi, as well as a kind of conjuring of the radical decontextualization that defines the primal scene of enslavement, a kind of ontological theft marked by the absurdity of the false imposed name. I'm going to move on to a very different example now, but I'll just recall again that I mentioned wanting to follow contradictions, one of the main ones being the contradiction between cinema being both preservation and repression of slavery's history. I spent some time discussing filmfārsi, and I'm going to move to a very different genre. Well, it's not so different. What I'm arguing is that this genre, the Iranian New Wave, opposes itself to commercial filmmaking. And essentially, So, essentially, I'm arguing for a kind of antagonism between filmfārsi and alternative or experimental filmmaking, which is grounded in a desire for political orientation in the wake of the kinds of existential instabilities introduced by modernity, and more specifically, top-down Pahlavi modernization. And one of the primary ways that alternative filmmakers rebelled against the commercial mode was through a kind of explicit disdain for its editing strategies. So instead of this kind of manic and haphazard montage that characterized filmfārsi, New Wave films promoted techniques like the long take and continuity editing. To give you an idea of what I mean by that, I'll play a short clip of a film which is considered one of the first films of the New Wave.
سلام، دیروز کجا بودی؟ دون شما حال ندار بودم، شایده بودم. حالا چی؟ حالت خوبه؟ بد نیستم. خب الحمدلله. بفرمایید. خدا شفات.
So against the escapism of filmfārsi, alternative filmmakers were above all interested in cinema as a kind of aesthetic tool for reorienting us to reality, which they understood as fundamentally political. And part of what I argue is that these stylistic strategies used to distinguish high from low cinema were primarily borrowed from the genre of ethnographic documentary. And in fact, many alternative filmmakers were also amateur ethnographers, including the filmmaker who made this film, Nasser Taqbai. So the second chapter, which I'm going to discuss now, focuses on this co-development of the Iranian New Wave and ethnographic cinema, and specifically the films that I look at chronicle spirit rituals practiced by the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Persian Gulf, and one of these rituals is called Zar. I'll just take a minute to describe Zar before I enter into what I hope to gain from thinking about its cinematic documentation. So there's a general consensus among anthropologists that Zar is a kind of trace of Indian Ocean slavery. It's thought of as a kind of relic that has been passed down through generations of slave descendants, and different versions are practiced throughout Southwest Asia, North and East Africa. And there is some debate about this, but it's generally assumed that Zar moved through the Indian Ocean with the movement of slaves. The basic framework of Zar is therapeutic, but it encompasses an entire cosmology that includes acceptance of spirit winds that can take over a person's body and spirit, controlling their affect and behavior. And an elaborate ceremony is usually held to either divine the spirit wind's identity or to facilitate a therapeutic relationship between the wind and the person who's been afflicted. None of the films I discuss in the book are actual representations of slavery. The only one that comes somewhat close to doing so is this ethnographic documentary about Zar. And there were a few different things that I noticed about it. So again, there's this kind of emphasis on the long take, on continuity filming that comes to foreshadow the role of these stylistic techniques in the New Wave's attempts at political realism. And there's especially a kind of concern for capturing the Zar ceremony in its entirety. Here we go. I'm just going to show a very brief clip of what I mean by trying to capture the documentary, trying to capture the ritual in its entirety. So the whole point of continuity editing in ethnographic documentary is this idea that film is a kind of raw material, that it's an almost objective text that can be mined over and over again. But there's a discrepancy, or again, a contradiction between the intention of capture behind this technique and the object that's being captured. So in the ritual of Zar, there's a moment of self-fragmentation, which culminates in a loss of consciousness. In fact, the most important aspect of the ceremonial structure is this entry into what we might translate as trance. And we can think about this entry as both a state of being occupied and as a state of emptiness. And the ethnographic studies on Zar also shore this up, this idea that Zar participants describe their own experience as a kind of amnesia or loss of self. Without this moment of disintegration, the ritual is not considered successful. So I mentioned earlier that Zar is considered a trace of Indian Ocean slavery. I wanted to think about it as a distinct register of historical memory. But what kind of historical memory is this that culminates in a loss of consciousness? Don't we usually associate history with consciousness? But if from the practices transmitted by the enslaved we could learn something about what a history of Indian Ocean slavery looks like, what we see is that this model conflicts with our expectations. An emphasis on surrender rather than discovery, on loss rather than recovery. And how do we contend with the idea of a loss that is not merely melancholic, but therapeutic, central to healing from history? How do we take seriously the practices that emerge from slavery as the basis to understanding its historicity, rather than beginning with the prior presumption of what that history's form should and will look like? So this central and recurring loss is something I follow, again, at multiple levels of abstraction. The ceremonial drumming rhythm that culminates in chants, the rupture to context inherent to slavery, and the internal contradiction of facts. The fact that facts, to be what they are, need to be able to be repeated. And yet, repetition, the process of transmission, inevitably leads facts astray. So once again, to return to my engagement at the beginning with contemporary politics of storytelling of Indian Ocean slavery, I ask how we can address the racial injuries of slavery without yielding to the blind accumulation of facts that drives contemporary knowledge production and its consumption. And in response, I tried to tell a story about the possibilities of a history that resists facts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The wonderful thing about these talks is that it always seem to deepen the world a little bit. And, you find out about things you've never had thought about. It's really fascinating. Thank you. Are you up for some questions?
Sure.
Okay. If you have a question, let me know. I'll bring the mic over to you. And, Suzette will monitor chat, see if anything comes through. Let people ruminate a bit, I guess.
Hi, Parisa. Sorry, I'm terrified about speaking into a microphone. Hi, this was so fascinating and so rich, and in a way, the questions, I'm just asking them because nobody had raised their hand, and I didn't necessarily, I don't know if there are questions that you care to engage with at all. But my first question was about the role of sound in each of these clips, because it's so fascinating, and I was just curious if that's something that you reflect on in the book. And the other is, as somebody who has done work in East Africa, I'm so curious about that side of the story, and I know that that's not your focus, so take this with that in mind. But I am curious about the czar ritual as a trace, as the way that it's described as a trace of Indian Ocean slavery, whether in what you've read that's the case also for its presentation, for its practice in Ethiopia, for instance. Is it a trace of Indian Ocean slavery on sort of both sides of the equation, so to speak? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. The question of who is considering this ritual to be a trace of slavery. And I think one of the things that really interests me about the ritual is the impossibility of gathering ethnographic material about it, even though that is sort of my own access is through this ethnographic research that's been done. And the reason that I don't think ethnographic research is really able to engage very deeply with the essence of czar or any of these parallel spirit healing rituals that exist throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa in different forms, is because there's a kind of secrecy involved. These are secret rituals, and in fact, this clip I showed, this film was the filmmaker kind of fortuitously was able to get access to the ceremony because he lived near one of these communities, and somebody who was involved in the ceremony worked at his family's house. So it otherwise wouldn't have been possible to film this ceremony. And compared to other kinds of spirit rituals, which are analogous to it and that are more public, it really is very secret. And to the extent that the lyrics of the songs that are sung, the incantations, are sung in a language that's not necessarily intelligible by the people who are participating, or even by the people who are singing themselves. They don't know what these lyrics are. And I found that to be the case not only in the Southwest Asian context, which people would sometimes attribute to the fact that, these descendants of enslaved Africans have forgotten their original languages, they don't remember the original words. I found this to be the case also in African contexts, where there's a kind of language involved that's not supposed to be a very straightforwardly intelligible language. So there's a kind of secrecy to the transmission, which makes it difficult to say, this is about X, this is what this ritual is about. And yet, nevertheless, we can kind of identify it as a trace because it's associated with these communities, the communities of descendants of the enslaved. So sound, that's a really good question. As I was saying kind of toward the end, one of the things that I'm interested in is following this core absence that I see in Zar, the climax, which is a sort of loss of consciousness, an absence that's followed through at different levels. And one is kind of happening at the level of sound, although there it's not really an absence, it's sort of the repetition of the drumming. How does it, what is the connection between that repetition and what happens with this culmination in loss? Thank you. I would love to chat more with you about the East African side of this.
Thanks, Parisa. That was really so very fascinating. I just have kind of a speculative question that in the beginning you said, there was this triad of the technology of cinema and the theory of slavery and the concept of blackness, and I was very convinced and interested in this question of the resistance to information and resistance to fact, and yet there are these like preservations and repressions that happen at the same time. So my question is on the theory side. I would be curious to hear in how trying to think of this archive, or rather the traces in these cinematic archives, as well as these rituals and the traces of Indian Ocean slavery, their relationship to the theory, like black theory or black, I don't want to say black theory, black study, maybe the theories of that permeate black study. And if there were basically what that negotiation is, and between the archive and the kind of ways in which we have received or understand the certain kind of a trans-historical and trans-locale kind of understanding of racial blackness as such. So I would be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's so many layers to that question and so many different approaches. But I think maybe I'll just mentally to go back to that slide where I had all the different quotes. And there was that Sylvia Wynter quote at the bottom, the idea of blackness as a kind of constant disruption and recontextualization of its own meaning. And I think what I get from Sylvia Wynter, at least there in this kind of narrative she makes about blackness as a disruption to our idea of the concept of the human, is precisely that blackness is not a trans-historical concept. And she really focuses on this confluence of forces in the 1960s that erupts throughout different parts of the world, and which kind of transforms racial Blackness into this global signifier that becomes positively inflected. Because prior to that, Blackness was not a ubiquitously appreciated term among African Americans. People often preferred to be called African American or even Negro to being called Black. It's only now in this moment that we kind of assume that there's this natural correlation. So she really focuses on a global confluence of forces where there really is a complete rupture with prior kinds of signification that were associated with Blackness, in particular negative associations that people had, which made them not want to identify as Black. So there's this disruption and recontextualization of racial Blackness that is in some way originary to it. That's originary to racial Blackness. So the reason why I insist on that is because there's a lot of resistance now, as I was kind of showing at the beginning, to contemporary efforts by Black collectives in the Indian Ocean, in Southwest Asia, in North Africa as well, to identify as Black or self-associate as Black. There's a resistance to recognizing the coherence of that because it's imagined that there's this kind of context purity to racial Blackness. Whereas what Sylvia Wynter is showing is that no, originarily racial Blackness is this kind of disruption to something like an original context.
I think we have some chats online, questions online.
Okay, so we have a question from Kate Pourshariati, and she asks, I might have missed if you talked about Haji Firuz in the context of your footage with the character in Blackface.
No, I didn't talk about Haji Firuz, but is that the entire question? Okay. So this improvisatory tradition, siyah bazi, that I was pointing to in the scenes that we watched, which we might here now recognize as Blackface scenes. There's a version of that called Haji Firuz, which appears during the Persian New Year, and it's a person who wears blackface and kind of dances in the streets. But this is a good question because I think it speaks to the reason why I kind of insist on this context instability of Blackness, of racial Blackness, and this, particularly in relation to this practice, because this is still a beloved practice. Siyah bazi is still a beloved practice for many people. And there is a collective resistance to recognizing any association with slavery, even though it's pretty obvious that the main figure is taking on the rhetorical posture of a slave. There's a resistance that's kind of mired in a narrative about this figure's origins in ancient mythology and ancient practices of women blackening their faces in mourning, for example. So there are all these like sinuous genealogies that people have concocted to explain away what this means and to kind of defend it from the accusation of being blackface. And I do find it really fascinating that it continues to be the case, that people continue to hold on to these narratives in the name of context specificity. So there's a cultural particularity to this practice that you can't assimilate to Western forms of blackface minstrelsy because you have to look at the context. But then if you kind of follow the logic further, all you find is that the contexts that are being conjured up are actually completely ahistorical, atemporal. They're mired in mythology, not in actual historical evidence.
And the second question, and Kate says thank you. The second question is from Parvane, who asks, could you please explain the terminology filmfārsi and who coined it?
Yeah, there is a little bit of debate about when it was coined, but it's generally attributed to the film critic Amir Hussain Qaboossi. I had a quote from him up on one of the slides. And filmfārsi was a derogatory term and is still more or less a derogatory term for this commercial mode of filmmaking. And the idea of filmfārsi is that nothing really unites these films. They have no kind of substance other than the fact that they're in Persian, they're in Farsi, so they're called filmfārsi. And it's interesting because this really was the dominant mode of commercial filmmaking in the mid-20th century. It's interesting because internationally it's completely unknown. Internationally, what's usually recognized as Iranian cinema or associated with Iranian cinema is post-revolutionary art cinema, the kinds of films you might think about when you think about Abbas Kiarostami, for example, or this more kind of avant-garde experimental filmmaking associated with the New Wave. But by far, filmfārsis were more popular amongst domestic audiences, and these other forms were very statistically marginal.
Other questions from the room?
So when we compare the history of slavery in modern Iran with history of sexuality in modern Iran, we see some similarities. We can recognize some similar techniques of truth-telling. And so it's generally collective reform, denial, oblivion, and then denial. And my question is, what does this tell us about the origin of this technique of truth-telling, if you would consider it as a technique of truth-telling?
Can you elaborate a little bit? What do you mean by truth-telling?
This idea of, against the facts, and how should we trust the facts, and how facts actually can misguide us. And so there is a reform in the slavery in Iran, and then the denial of the existence of slavery. And we have the same thing about sexuality, about the history of sexuality in modern Iran as well. So it seems that so they changed the definition and the origin of slavery and the origin of homosexuality in modern Iran. They connect it to the Western society. So my question is this a general technique of truth-telling in modern Iran? And is there other cases?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I'm a bit resistant to generalizing this history of slavery to other topics. Sexuality I haven't really even entered into that in the context of slavery. So your question is challenging for the reason that it brings out this kind of tension inside of the resistance on both sides. So on the one hand, there's, as I was saying, a kind of collective resistance to knowing about this history, a kind of collective resistance to the facts of slavery. But that's one kind of resistance. I think I'm focusing more on a different kind of resistance that I find to be internal to the facts themselves. Internal to the facts to the extent that it makes it difficult to say in a very straightforward way that there simply are facts and we're resisting those. It's as if there's something inside of the facts that's indeterminate or problematic that I'm pulling out of these specific materials in a way that at the moment, I'm reluctant to generalize, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you later about this.
Any other questions? One more from online. Okay.
Shayvyar, I hope I didn't say that too horribly. Kazis asks, the filmfārsi posters reminded me a lot of posters from the 60s and 70s Bollywood and Pakistani film. I'm wondering how the cinema operated in relationship to those cinemas, if they did at all, and would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, there are absolutely importations of elements from Hindi language films, Egyptian melodramas of the era. And so that's part of when we talk about the kind of manic montage of filmfārsi. It actually extends beyond the individual editing strategies of each of the films or non-existent editing strategies. It's more like the assimilation of all of these different global elements, not only from Hindi language films, Egyptian films, also American cinema, which creates a kind of truly hybrid kind of montage artifact that I'm trying to read in a different way that's not just sort of disparaging and kind of pointing out the weaknesses.
I'm actually glad that question came up, because when you were showing the Farsi montage, I was seeing D'Argento, I was seeing Mario Bava, and I was wondering if what kind of an influence European cinema, genre cinema at the time might have had. Were people seeing those films in Iran? I have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. They were imported. American language film, English language films were imported, and actually those tended to be more popular among more elite classes, and filmfārsis tended to cater more toward working class audiences. But absolutely, American films, European films were imported and dubbed into Persian, and Persian language audiences would have seen these films as well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, and these really kind of unusual, rarely seen films, and exposing us to some aspects of life on Earth that we probably were not always aware of.
Thank you.
I just want to let everyone know that the next Chats in the Stacks talk, which will feature Courtney Ann Roby, who is Associate Professor in Classics, Medieval Studies, and Science and Technology Studies, and she'll be discussing her book, The Mechanical Tradition of Hero of Alexandria, which is published by Cambridge University Press. It's going to be in this room, so you're going to have to find your way here again, sorry to say, on Wednesday, February 21st, and same time, 4:30 to 5:30. So thank you again, and thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And take some cookies on the way out.